So one of the biggest misconceptions in Guild Wars 2 is that there are specific Condi and power bosses. Today we want to clear out this confusion, and I want to explain everything that you need to know to actually understand when to play power and when to play condition, or rather why this is actually the misconception. As always, thanks a lot to all my supporters on YouTube, Twitch and Patreon, and now let's jump right in. So I want to start and quickly explain what is power and what is condition damage. So these are the two archetypes of playing a DPS build in Guild Wars 2. So either you deal direct damage, which means you deal power damage. So your attacks deal 10k damage and you do that every single second, then you have a DPS of 10k. So that means that you have strike damage, and whenever you attack, you deal that damage. When you stop attacking, you stop dealing damage. A condition damage build is, so to say, a dot build, so a damage over time build. So you attack, the attack itself does, let's say, minuscule damage, but it applies a damage over time effect that then ticks for a specific duration. Burning ticks shorter but has higher tick damage, while bleeding ticks longer and has lower tick damage. So this is the typical two archetypes between power and condition damage builds. So why is now Condi worse, strictly speaking? Strictly speaking, power damage is always the superior option. Why is that? Because power damage has no delay. Power damage to deal your attacks damage, and you will instantly get, so to say, the benefit of getting the damage number 2 on the boss health bar. But a condition damage build applies damage and takes a while to actually deal the full damage of the attack. That can be quite long, depending on what kind of condition you actually typically use to deal that. But it can also be rather fast, for example, if you use a burn build. But in general, condition damage is always slower than a burst build. There are of course some exceptions, because some builds are having some kind of ramp up time. Best example here would be a power chronomancer that needs some time to actually spawn all the phantasms that deal then damage and respawn and stuff. But typical power builds have way better burst damage than Condi builds. That's the biggest thing here, and that's why Condi builds are, strictly speaking, if you have the option between choosing those two, you would always go for a power build, because a power build will instantly deal damage, while a Condi build needs some time. Following that, you then have to understand that all bosses in Guild Wars 2 should be considered power bosses, or bosses that power is better on, before you make any other assumptions. The reason for that is there is never a boss in Guild Wars 2 where you would say, okay, you should take Condi just baseline, because power is not possible to actually work. Because power will always be better than condition damage. Applying damage directly without any delay is always better than having a ramp up time. There is no exception to this rule. However, and that's the important part, why are some bosses considered Condi bosses by the community? This is a very big misconception. They are not considered Condi bosses for the most part. They are considered bosses where Condi builds are better. They are not better because they are Condi builds. They could be also power builds, but the reason they are better there is that they have ranged attacks. Typically, and that's a really weird thing that is happening in Guild Wars 2, is that you have power builds that are very typically melee builds. So they are fully melee, so they're using greatsword and sword, for example, something like that. Whereas a Condi build uses, for example, a scepter and maybe some kind of other ranged weapon. I don't want to go in particular builds here, but typically it's the case that Condi builds have some kind of ranged option. Sometimes they even are fully ranged, like a condition virtuoso. And that means that they have an advantage in fights where you have to split, where you have to do mechanics, where you just can't continuously DPS the boss in melee range. And then the power build actually gets some kind of disadvantage over the Condi build. But it's not because of the Condi or the power playstyle, it's because of the ranged and the melee playstyle. So keep that in mind. That's the big misconception here. Bosses should be considered ranged or melee bosses, and then it would be more clear. But, and that's the important part, there are, to make it even more confusing, bosses that are actually favoring Condis over power if they have, for example, some kind of toughness baseline, or have some kind of protection buff up, or something like that, but it's really rare in Guild Wars 2. So it's more like the boss itself is some kind of having mechanics that helps Condi or power builds. Two examples that I bring out, or three rather, from raids. So you have Matthias, where you have the sacrifice. That means that a player gets sacrificed, and the player has something around 40 to 50k HP, and you have to CC this player to get them out of the sacrifice. However, you can also damage this player. So if you play a power build, you have a crazy burst damage, you could accidentally burst this person. However, if you are playing a Condi build, it takes a little bit longer. So this is one reason why on Matthias you could actually say this is more of a Condi build fight and not only a ranged fight. But that's, let's say, only one exception here. And you could also make the argument, for example, for Soulless Horror, so SH in Wing 5, because there are these mobs spawning that you have to knock away, and they should die after a while and not instantly, because if they instantly die, you can't knock them away. But if you, so to say, apply damage over time effects to them and then knock them away, they will die out of range. That makes sense there as well. There are also other exceptions. For example, Veil Guardian has a lower than average toughness on the boss, where power damage is even better than usual, because you deal more power damage to a boss that has less toughness than usual. So there are some kind of really weird interactions there, so keep that in mind. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but the thing is, bosses typically are considered melee or ranged bosses and not really Condi or power bosses, but there are some exceptions to that rule. So what is the dilemma here now? Because there is, in my opinion, a big dilemma that it's first of all not really clear why melee or ranged are considered Condi or power at the same time, respectively, because I think there should be not a clear split. It should be, you should have power builds that are melee and ranged. You should have Condi builds that are melee and ranged. I think that should be the case. That's straight up, in my opinion, the correct balanced decision to make. However, this is not always the case. There are some builds that are power and ranged, like for example Power Virtuoso, with Greatsword especially, but most of the time it's still this rather clear split. Another exception of that rule would, for example, Rival Mech, but for the most part it actually still holds true that power builds are typically melee and Condi builds have typically a rather huge ranged option as well. So in my opinion, the balancing here should be addressed. It should be the case that a Condi build overall should not have the range advantage. I think a range advantage in the build itself should not depend on power or Condi. I think the range advantage should be considered in terms of the DPS. So the end resulting DPS on the benchmark should include if it's a ranged or melee build. I think melee builds on average should have more DPS than a ranged build, because the ranged build has the advantage of higher damage uptime. Straight up, that's my take. But that's not the only thing that I think they should fix or change. I think it's also important that DPS benchmark in the end of a Condi build that is in melee range and a power build that is also in melee range, if you compare them, I think the power build should have less DPS on average than the Condi build. Why is that? Because I think a power build has the advantage of having burst damage. So that means you can apply a lot of burst damage. Builds that have slow ramp up time have to have higher DPS in the end, because they get punished if you play them in phase heavy fights. So I think a power build that has a very high burst should have lower DPS on average than a slow ramp up Condi build. But that's also holding true, for example, a slow ramp up power build, for example, like I mentioned already, Power Chronomancer should have higher on average DPS if the fight takes longer than a bursty power build. So even there it holds true that not only a build that is Condi or power should be compared, but also the power builds itself depending on the burst damage. I know this might be a little bit hard to balance, but I think that's what their job after all is. Then also you should take into consideration that the stat you need for the build. For example, power build typically needs power, precision and ferocity in a build to actually make the power build work. You want to have 100% crit chance, you want to have the highest power and ferocity possible. A Condi build, however, only needs condition damage and expertise. Or at least some Condi builds only need Condi damage and get their one conditions that they use, for example, to 100% duration already with just using food and traits and runes, for example. And this is really interesting that those two are already in the stat direction split. I personally think that's okay at the current point in the game, because you currently don't have condition damage and expertise only gear, because that would have then higher stats and that would be easier to achieve very high damage number with that. But currently you also get some tanky stats with that, or for example go into power as well and get therefore a little bit more damage in a Condi build. But I think the stats overall should be also looked at in that sense. What kind of stats are used here? And lastly, and that's the most important option actually, that is also a very big balancing problem, is that a lot of the Condi builds, especially the really easy ones to play, let's say like Condi Virtuoso or Condi Scourge, that are really nice in terms of how easy they are to play and how flexible they are, because they are typically used, for example, in progression runs where you have really hard challenging fights and you have to concentrate on the mechanics a lot, and you can't really concentrate too much on your rotation, and you need to have something that is flexible and even works in chaotic fights. So builds like that are not only easy to execute and quite straightforward to play, but also, and that's the important part, have amazing flexibility and utility in the kit. So for example, if you look at the two examples mentioned, Condi Virtuoso and Condi Scourge, they have some built-in sustain, they have barrier, they have passive healing, they have some invulnerability on Virtuoso, and they have, for example, let's look at Virtuoso more closely. They have invulnerability with the distortion, they have teleport options with blink and even portal in there, they have blocks in there, they have potentially evades and a lot of CC. So I think that's the problem as well, that the power builds typically take a lot of their utility to get DPS, whereas a Condi build, like those Condi builds, have so much utility while they still have the best damage option possible or somewhat close to the best damage option, so that it's actually, I think, a big balancing problem, even though the DPS of those Condi builds that I just mentioned is lower on average than a full DPS power build, for example. But, and that's the problem in my opinion, you don't have any power option that rivals this Condi build for the most part in terms of flexibility and utility. Yes, you could make the argument that there are some builds now slowly coming up that have that as well, like Power Virtuoso or Power Rival Mech, but they are not even close to the utility, in my opinion, to a Condi Virtuoso or Condi Scourge. So I think this is another big balancing problem, that you have typically Condi builds have great utility, whereas power builds are very niche in terms of what the utility actually is. It's more like only DPS. But this discussion itself goes a little bit too far. I just wanted to mention that here in the balancing, that this is a big problem and they should address that. But what I want you to take away from this video is there are no Condi bosses for the most part in Guild Wars 2. There are just ranged or melee bosses. That's the big misconception here. There are just power bosses all the time, but melee or ranged bosses. This is more the distinction you should make. I hope this is now clear and hope you actually agree with me on that. Please let me know your takes in the comments. I also hope you liked this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks again to all my supporters on YouTube, Twitch and Patreon, and I hope to see you all in the next video.